So many people are worried about the decisions that they make today impacting the rest of their life. But we're going to be talking about how just moving forward can actually be the key to your success. On today's Speak and Get What You Want podcast, I'm here with one of the greatest guests of all time, best friend from high school, Brian Jones. How are you, my friend?
Good. Good to see you, Kerby.
Oh man, let me tell you something. We've got some tremendous stories we could share about those glorious high school days, but we'll just jump into where we're at today. Now, Brian, let me just ask you this. Now we're in our 50s. Would you have ever thought in a million years that you would be where you are right now 30, 40 years ago?
No, probably not. Although I have to say, before we kind of get into the substance of this, that is to some degree relevant to like kind of my evolution and my story is I didn't really have a strong vision of like where I was going, you know? I didn't necessarily know or have a really strong idea about what I wanted to be doing. And I think that did contribute to some degree where I ended up for the negative. That's also contributed to kind of where I've ended up as the positive. So the answer to that question is no. I mean, I just wouldn't have had the foggiest idea of where I was going to be 40, 34 years down the road.
Oh, that's an interesting point you bring up. So do you think, what was it? Did you just were kind of just going through the motions of your life in your early 20s, not really certain on where you wanted to be?
Yeah, I think so. I think in general, from a temperament standpoint, you know, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, but I think going through the motions isn't maybe as accurate as I was just kind of doing whatever I thought I was supposed to be doing or whatever the thing that came next. I didn't really spend a lot of time thinking and considering, like, where do I want to be? You know, I went to college because it was like you go to college after high school, and that's a great thing to do. Like, I don't regret that. I think it's served me really well. But I never put a ton of time into, do I want to go to college? What do I want to study? Got to the end of college, and it's like, now I'm getting ready to graduate college, and I've got a wife and a kid on the way, and what am I going to do for a career? And so it was like, graduate school might be a good idea, so I decided to go to law school. And so there's nothing wrong with the choices I was making, but they weren't really intentional choices. I was not being very intentional about my life. And kind of, if I, you know, have a message here, it's not really about intentionality, although I could certainly speak to kind of the perils of a lack of intentionality. I suspect a lot of your listeners are very intentional people to kind of follow you the way you are. But no, I wasn't. I was just kind of like reacting in a lot of ways to different stimuli that were coming my way. And then I would make a decision, you know, and I think there are some benefits to that in terms of taking things as they come and dealing with some of the difficulties that happen. But those things also create some of those difficulties as well. I can certainly acknowledge that.
Wow. Okay. But this kind of, if people knew you well, they would know that you're a strategist at heart. I mean, that's what you do, is you go create outcomes. And so people hire you because you have tremendous understanding and grasp of what it means to be strategic and then go execute on it. So help me understand. You're a great strategist for others, but for you growing up, that wasn't always the case.
Yeah, I mean, from a personal standpoint, for whatever reason, whether it's just temperament or whether it's, you know, an accumulation of experiences, I don't know. I just felt like I was very reactive. Now, I will say, I don't know that I would call myself a strategist. I think what I do in my kind of job, and I guess to some degree in my life, is a little more of a facilitator. I think I'm, you know, putting people together. So if there's a strategy or an outcome, one of the things that I do, and that I think I'm decent at, is knowing who would be really good to accomplish that. And so I find myself, that's one of the things I do, is I connect people a lot and tell, you know, I'll ask people.
Okay, but
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, let's not over romanticize strategy for a moment. Strategy is when someone says, I'm super strategic. Strategy is just simply saying, we're climbing that hill over there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so what you're really good at is creating an outcome by connecting the right people.
Yeah, which in and of itself is a strategy. That's right. I mean, I agree with that.
Right.
And a lot of strategy, I guess, could be said is identifying a problem, being able to isolate it, its components, breaking it down and things like that. So, yeah, and I'm not really sure why.
Yeah.
In my personal life, I don't know. Yeah, it's a conversation I've had with my ex-wife and relationships and therapists. It's one of the great things in my life. It's been a through line, part of that also is, and this really does have to do with kind of my story, all the way through, is I was very much a pleaser, which those two things I think make sense that they go together. But that also has a lot to do with kind of the way I behaved and the way I responded to things and some of the outcomes that created for myself.
Okay, wait, stop there for a second. You used a phrase that I bet a lot of people are guilty of falling into, and that is you called yourself a pleaser. What is that? Why did you choose that word there for a second?
I mean, it's certainly a phrase that I've heard, but I think it's appropriate. Caring a lot about what other people think or thought of me, in terms of, and that could manifest itself in multiple different ways. If I didn't have strong feelings about what I was going to do for a career or where I was going to work or whatever the case may be, if other people did, or I had a perception that other people did, then maybe I would, do what I thought other people wanted. I also think that I, had a history of, when I was younger, certainly really worrying about whether people were disappointed in me and wanting to avoid that. And that's, again, I'm sure it's complicated. People who are involved in mental health are probably out there listening to this that have strong ideas about that, but that does create problems. It does create problems when avoiding confrontation or, avoiding any type of conflict. If that's a driver, that can really cause problems. And that was one of the reasons I ended up, where I ended up,
Okay, so if you were today, now, would you call yourself a pleaser today?
Much less. I think it is part of my, again, whether it's kind of an inherent genetic makeup or whether it's temperament or whether it's a cause of, experience of it when I was young. I certainly think it's something that, to some degree, I tend toward, although I think the experiences that I had, some of the things that we kind of talked about in the preamble, some of the questions we talked about, really affected that, really affected both in terms of the necessity of letting go of that to the extent possible to recover from really difficult situations, and also just kind of a change in perspective, and realizing that that's not a tenable way to live your life. It makes things really, really difficult.
So obviously, through experiences, you're less of a pleaser today,
certainly,
than you were, 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah, 20 years ago.
So then, let me ask you this, Brian: if you were to go back 20 years and you tell yourself 3 things that you should do to overcome this challenge that you had of always trying to please other people, worried about what other people thought of you, what 3 things would you tell yourself 20 years ago?
That's really interesting because I actually, I have 4 kids, and some of them struggle with this to some degree, but one of them I see a lot of myself in, and I worry about this for him. And I've had these conversations with him, and I think that conversation tends to often be centered in, hey, you can't care what other people think about you, you deserve better, go after what you want, or value your own ideas. I think from a practical standpoint, what I've tried to kind of relay to my kids is, like, this has the potential to ruin your life. Like, I know we tend to think about pleasing as, oh, well, I'll go wherever anybody else wants to go eat, or I don't really care where I sit, or, just kind of avoiding conflict. But the reality is, in ways that I think it's tough to foresee, if that's kind of the way we operate, there's the potential for that to cause really, really significant problems in your life. And so that's something I would try to tell myself if I could go back. It's what I try to tell my kids. The problem is it's really difficult to internalize that from an intellectual standpoint without feeling that and really feeling the consequences. For me, that's not something that really got through until I was living with the consequences of it, and that's a tough gap to bridge, I think.
Okay, but then what did I mean? You had to make some intentional decisions to say, okay, I've got to be better at not worrying about what people think so much. So what did you do?
Well, I mean, to some degree, you just make up your mind to do that. I will say, for me, the kind of experiences that I went through were a blessing and a curse in that way, because it's a curse in the sense that these were experiences and outcomes that really had really negative consequences on my life and the life of those around me. But it also forced me into a place where, you can either choose to stop caring what people think, choose to start living your life, to stop living your life based on what other people want you to do. Or in some cases, that decision will be made for you, and if people kind of around you in a very meaningful, potentially public way, all have, a really bad opinion of you, for example, you're going to have to make a choice about whether to continue to care about that or try to rehabilitate or perform for those people. I think in that situation, it's probably easier, if I'm being honest, to say, like, I can't possibly continue to live my life the way other people think. It's gotten to that point where not only do I see that it's negative, but there's too many people. Like, it's jumped the banks now, like it just can't go on. It can't happen. And so that's the whole point with my kids is, like, don't get to the point where you're forced to make a change, which will be better for your life, but the things that have to come to pass to bring you to that point are probably going to be really unpleasant for you.
Oh man, and Jones, it's such an important thing to tackle, because I don't think ever in the history of the world has there been such a focus on people comparing themselves to others and wanting everyone else to like them and feel like, I mean, Jones, would you want to start raising kids all over again? I mean,
no, for multiple reasons, but it's a crazy time. The comparisons, real-time comparisons, the visual, I often think back to when we were in high school. Human nature doesn't necessarily change, but the tools and the implementations of those things definitely vary over the generations. And the way kids compared themselves, the way bullying took place, the way it's so different now, and it feels, I'm sure every generation of parents feels that way, but it feels so much scarier because with phones and things that go on in private, the kids can, how do you even know, let alone how do you correct that or fix it or help your kids have the self-esteem they need? Like, it's terrifying.
Oh, no question. But what's interesting, Brian, is that people say all the time, they tell me, people, especially those in their 20s and 30s, they say all the time, they say, I want to make impact. I want to make an impact. I want to help other people. I really want others to be better off because they've been in my presence, right? That I've given them tools, I've given them inspiration, whatever it might be. But how do you separate wanting to have impact from wanting just to please everybody? Because it seems like, as you're talking about it, you've always wanted to please everybody. You always wanted everyone to feel good about their relationship with you and what you bring to the table. Well, how do you have positive influence and impact without falling into that trap of trying to please people?
That's a really good question. I've never thought about it from that standpoint, but it does occur to me, like, as you're asking that question. And by the way, I know we haven't really gotten into the specifics of like my journey and my situation. I don't know if you want to talk about it at some point, but one of the things that was a really powerful, it was both an outcome and also a driver. So it was an outcome of, hitting, if you want to use the term, rock bottom, but also a driver of coming out of that on the other side was a real shift in perspectives and values for me. And this was my personal experience, but kind of all the things that transpired led me to a place where I had a real change in perspective and values. And I realized, I think, to answer your question directly, earlier in my life, I don't think that I had a real drive. I mean, I wanted to be a good person. I wanted to be a good dad. I wanted the people around me to, I wanted to be, but it is tricky to just divide that line, to find the divider between, am I actually being a good person and creating good outcomes and doing good things, or do I just judge my goodness or success on how other people are responding to me? And those two things are certainly not always the same thing. But the situation I found myself in, I had that change in perspective, and I decided, because of some of the things that I decided were important to me going forward, there was no way I was going to be able to serve those things and also please all the people around me. And so when I finally just came up with a true set of values that were really important to me, and not just things that either had been handed to me or that I'd been taught as a kid, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but when I finally started thinking about what is really important to me, what are the things that I really value, I think it became very obvious that I'm going to have to let go of that, because if I'm going to be true to these and try to advance those, not everyone's going to like that. And that has to be okay, or I'm not going to be able to do that.
Right. And so all of a sudden, by obtaining your values or getting clear on what you valued, it then made you, or equipped you with the ability to have impact, instead of falling into that trap of just pleasing everybody. Because when you were pleasing everybody, you didn't even know why you were pleasing or how you were pleasing them.
Yeah, I mean, I was just,
right.
That was the paramount value, was, you know what I mean? Like, not that I thought about it consciously, but it's like, make people happy, like, please people, do the things they want. And I think the reality is, I know, as someone who's been successful and who has very strong values, and the people that you deal with every day, I don't think it's possible to have strong values and serve those values and try to advance those values without upsetting somebody. And if you find yourself in your life where you're like, nobody is upset with me, everybody seems really pleased with me, that's probably a red flag that there's something wrong there, and you're falling short in some way.
Yeah, I heard a marketing expert once say that when you are marketing, if you haven't irritated somebody by noon, you're not marketing hard enough, right? You're not sharing what you represent loud enough, because you haven't made that much of an impact. And so Jones, you come out of college, you're an attorney, and this desire to please everybody actually impacted your work as an attorney.
Yeah, it did. And it might not have, I mean, maybe it's possible to slip through that. For me, where that really, where the rubber really hit the road there, and I think this is probably a valuable lesson to any young people, professionals, certainly within the legal field, where there's, there's a really heavy emphasis on ethics, and the consequences of falling on the wrong side of that are so severe. I found myself in a situation where I started to have questions about something that I was being asked to do by a client, or something that I thought a client was doing. I had instincts that I was not comfortable with what was going on. And instead of, A, not only trusting myself, but B, saying, I need to really make sure that I know what's going on here, that I'm on the right side of things, that I'm, doing the right things, I kind of looked around, and it was like, well, the people around me, the partners, everybody seems to be okay. I'll just go with it. And it's really, and then, by the way, that's not to impugn any of the partners that I worked with. That's not what I'm saying. It was a very much, don't cause waves. If everyone else seems fine, don't cause trouble, path of least resistance kind of a mindset. And I ended up in a lot of trouble because of that.
Right. But you were afraid because you wanted, you didn't want to rock the boat, right? Many of us use that phrase. I just want to rock the boat. Everyone else seems okay. I don't want to be perceived as somebody who, is an irritant. I want to be, that doesn't seem like that big of a deal. And that feeling, that gut feeling you had you followed it, how different would your life have been?
Well, it would have been very different. I joke with friends who are lawyers that, they're jealous of me that I am like a disbarred, ex-attorney because I'm the lucky one. So things would have gone better professionally, but in all honesty, I'm very happy with kind of where I am in my life. I don't think I had to go through all those things to get here. But I think it's interesting because I look back on that situation, and I look back on how trapped I felt when I felt like I'm really uncomfortable with what's happening with this client. And I look back and I'm like, why not just talk to somebody? Looking back in retrospect, I don't understand why I felt in such an untenable position. But I remember at the time feeling like I feel trapped. I don't know what to do about this. And I think that really does go to what we've been talking about. For some reason, I just hadn't developed that skill or the practice or created the situation in myself where it was like, I'm going to do something really hard and very uncomfortable. And I don't know how that's going to end up. But certainly looking back, even if I had done something and been fired by my firm because they thought I was a troublemaker, that would have been infinitely better than what happened. And you can't know that necessarily prospectively, but I just was not at a place where I had developed those skills or developed that sense of self to feel like I was able to do that. And so I just kind of continued to go with the flow in a very bad direction.
So how much does self-confidence impact people's desire to please everybody? Because do you think if you would have been more confident, it would have overridden that desire to just please everybody?
That's a really interesting question. It depends how you define that, I think. I actually I've never really considered myself necessarily to be a low self-esteem or someone with low self-confidence. I feel like I don't feel like I've necessarily had trouble recognizing the things I do well, or even recognizing that I do things well, or even a lot of things well. It's always felt a little bit like something else to me, and not that those two things aren't connected. Maybe self-worth would be a better way to describe that, because not necessarily that I felt like I was worthless, but clearly at some point I felt like advocating for myself or taking charge of my life or having a strong self-direction for my future, either it felt to me like it just didn't exist, but maybe that has something to do with feeling like, I'm not the kind of person that can do that. I never consciously felt I wasn't worthwhile, but maybe that's what it was. But I do think there is a meaningful distinction potentially between self-worth and self-confidence in terms of recognizing skills and talents and being able to utilize those. That's a little bit different than feeling like, but I'm worth someone who, could be a lawyer or could make a lot of money or could have whatever it is that we want. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be material things. I do think there's a little bit of difference between that. Feels a little more right to me than self-confidence, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I love that you said that you had that voice in your head that just said, I don't know if I'm the kind of attorney that can do that, or that little bit of a limiting belief. But which is awesome is, Brian, you look at where you are today, having incredible impact for good, having such an influence over so many people, blessing the lives of countless numbers of people. it's pretty phenomenal to see where you were. And I know we didn't spend a lot of time on this episode of that journey of getting disbarred to where you are today. But it really should be, when you hear the name Brian Jones, it should be a message of hope for everybody, because you may not have thought, well, whether it be self-worth or just your desire to please everybody got you in a difficult situation. Things didn't end up the way you thought they would be, but now you're in a position living a life with a job that you love, doing what you love, impacting those values you love. That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's incredible. I certainly feel very fortunate, whether you want to say blessed or lucky, or, I mean, it's probably a combination of a lot of things. I do think, though, when I was in that situation at the lowest, it's really tough. One of the things we talked about before this is, the question of, like, what's a message to people who feel like they've blown it all? They've blown their shot,
right,
over for them. It is really difficult to be in that position. It is tough to put yourself in someone else's position for positive. It's really tough to look at other people who have overcome, at least it was for me, and apply that to myself and say, well, that means that I can overcome. And again, I'm sure these things are all related. When you think about self-worth and why you ended up anyway, it can be really difficult. But I would just say, if there's a message, it's just as simple as saying, I just don't think, you would know this better because you deal in the area of, like, success and how people become successful and stay successful. I'm sure there are myriad examples of people at an old age remaking themselves, finding success where before they had found failure.
Yeah.
I just think about, I've heard, I don't know what the exact number is, but I've always heard it said that people change jobs, 3 times, 4 times in their lifetime. I think the reality is that for most of us, when we start out, when we find ourselves, let's say we feel like we found ourselves at some point, like you said, in the job or in the career or in our calling, I think for most of us, it is not what we thought we'd be doing. Now, not all of us took a massively circuitous route that involved, destruction and loss of, ruination. That is unusual and extreme. But I do think it's instructive to say, you don't know what you're going to be doing 10 years from now, and maybe you can't see it, but most of the people around you, even the people who are successful or who are doing careers they love, also couldn't see it 10 years ago. And that's not to recognize you have more to overcome, for sure, there's no question, but you're not in, if I can say this, you're not in that different a position than everyone else. Your hill may be steeper to climb, but it's also easy to look around and say, everyone around me has it together. These are people that pursued something, and they went out and they achieved it. But that's actually not true for most people. For most people, they had fits and starts and failed businesses and careers that didn't work out. Right. And it's not always extreme, but you're not in that different position than people around you, and you can find your way to that just like they did. Like I did. And I think that is a truism, and I think it's important to keep in mind.
Oh, that is awesome. I love it. And that's the message of hope. That's what you embody, Brian Jones, is that hope. And there's hope for everybody. And I love that you share that you look around and you see everyone else successful and you think that maybe their path was significantly different than yours, but it really wasn't. And there's hope for everybody. I love that, Brian.
Absolutely.
Jones, thank you. Thank you for everything you shared. Love your insights. We're going to do this again.
All right.
And I mean, we're best friends. This has to happen. So thanks for being with us, Jones. We'll see you, man.
All right. See ya.